Welcome back to the Athenium Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate. You can find me on X. I am at Jeremy Ryan Slate over there as well. If you guys want to find out more about the book club and jump in and join, you can check us out over at atheniumbooks.com. And today's conversation, I'm very excited for. The founders of Athenium had connected me to today's guest, and funny enough, I've actually been following him for about a year, so I was really looking forward to this conversation. And typically up to this point, we've been talking about a lot of great books, and we'll continue to do so. But today we're going to be talking about an important historical event, and that's really discussing something that does not get really wide play, and I'm kind of surprised about that, and that's what's happened in Rhodesia. So, Will Tanner, thank you for hanging out with me today, sir.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
So, Will, for people that might not know who you are, could you tell us a little bit about your background, and then also, it is a very, I guess, niche thing to be an expert in Rhodesia and the affairs around it, as you are. Could you tell us, kind of what was your way into that world?
Yeah, so we'll start with who I am. While I was in law school, I started a digital marketing company called the American Tribune with some guys I met online. We kind of do all sorts of stuff on the internet. And as I was coming out of law school and studying for the bar, which is anyone who's taken it can tell you both, it takes a lot of time, but it's also incredibly boring. So I started spending.
My brother-in-law, he's licensed in I think it's like over 30 states or something like that. So he had to take multiple bars. So I understand.
Yeah. So while I was doing that, I realized I had a little bit of free time. So I started spending more time on Twitter. Probably more time than was good for me, though. I did pass the bar. And it started posting about Rhodesia because it had been a long just fascination of mine and something I knew about and didn't really see many people talking about, though I thought it was an important subject. And so I figured I'd just start posting about it and did so. And that was back in the days when Twitter threads were still doing well instead of being suppressed. So wrote a lot of those, garnered some notoriety regarding it. And then it just kind of became something where I wrote more about it, learned more about it, and really stayed interested in it and was able to keep doing so. So that's how I kind of started writing about Rhodesia. In terms of getting into it, it's a somewhat convoluted story, but there was this author named Jeremy Scahill who wrote a book about Blackwater and Eric Prince that was supposed to be a hit piece, but to me, when I was like 9 and found it in Barnes & Noble, I thought it just made him the coolest guy ever. And so I was so into Blackwater.
It didn't achieve what it meant to do, apparently.
Not at all. And I was like, oh, this, or maybe I was 12, but regardless, I was like, this is awesome. And then so I got really into like Blackwater and private military contractors for a bit, which my parents thought was super weird. And through that, discovered Soldier of Fortune magazine. And the founder of that, Robert K. Browning, I think, or Brown, wrote his memoirs that are fun enough. But in it, he described smuggling guns through his local airport to Rhodesia so he could help them fight communists because there was an embargo on the country. And it's a fun story. And he describes like hunting communists in the Rhodesian bush with some like farmers over there who he was smuggling guns to. And I thought that was really cool. So I like knew about Rhodesia through that. And then through that, ended up thinking, well, like, why were they being embargoed? Why were we not helping them if they're fighting the communists? Because that's what we were told the War was all about. And so just from there, kept reading more about it, kind of had it in back of mind. And then one day, just when I was ordering my books for the month on Amazon or one of the other sites, I saw a copy of Ian Smith's The Great Betrayal and ordered that, which is his memoir and description of how Rhodesia was destroyed by the West and the communists. And that was a couple of years ago, and that's when I really just took off with it and started ordering more books, reading more, trying to find more online with information about it.
I'm curious. I do want to get into the history, but I'm just curious because I've encountered Rhodesia because I'm somebody that just thinks really deeply about subjects, and I'm always looking for, things that we don't typically learn about. And I'm curious, why don't you think that we learn about Rhodesia, frankly, at all? I think most people don't even know what it is.
Yeah, so I think if you look at like most of the Cold War, Reagan is an exception, and some of what Eisenhower did is an exception, but really the bulk of the Cold War than that, it's framed as this fight against communism, where America was out like stopping the communists from taking over the world, which is vaguely true in some senses, but isn't really true in most. Like if you look at what we did in Indochina. For a very long time, the CIA was supplying the guerrillas with bombs, even as they attacked the French and killed the French, who are a nominal ally. And then once we were there, what did we do in Vietnam? We stripped the landowners of their property. We helped destroy the Catholic Church. And then we pulled out once those bases of anti-communist support had been eradicated, which I found weird. And it's something that is hinted at even in mainstream histories of the conflict, but isn't really talked about much. And then that whole thing happened in Africa on a grand scale. And the imperial project was not just allowed to fade, but intentionally destroyed and very violently destroyed. And some of that is spoken about. You hear about Rwanda because that was a horror show in the 90s. You might hear maybe a thing or two about Kenya because sometimes the Mau Mau's come up, very, very rarely. And you'll probably hear about South Africa and how they were racists. And that's the one that people like bringing up because they can write off the whole history of that conflict and write off the communist conquest of South Africa. And make no mistake, Mandela was in the Communist Party. He was a communist-trained terrorist. That's why he was locked up, which is a side point. But they like promoting Mandela and denigrating the South Africans because the apartheid system allows them to connect that to the American civil rights movement and frame it as a moral victory for liberal democracy, essentially. Rhodesia, and this is getting to your question. I know this is a lengthy answer.
Well, no, I think it's interesting because if you look at I guess Kenya, not really, but if you look at the other two, there's a lot of examples in pop culture, right? Like,
yes.
Hotel Rwanda, the movie really got people thinking about Rwanda, right? I think before that, there really, for the average person, unless you're really plugged in, there wasn't a ton of awareness. And even for me, and this is going way back, I think in high school, we were one of the books we had to read was Cry the Beloved Country, about South Africa. So it's like at the same time, those are two things in popular culture that have been very promoted because there is a bit of an agenda around it.
Right. And like Invictus is that movie everyone had to watch about the South African rugby team. Left out
I didn't see that one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe that was just because I was in like middle school. But anyway, so, South Africa is in the popular culture for that reason. It allows them to fit it into the civil rights agenda. Rhodesia didn't have apartheid. It wasn't a racialist state, though it's often portrayed so by the left and some of the right. It just wasn't. It had restrictions on democracy. You had to have a certain amount of property to vote or have a certain level of educational attainment. Often there was a matrix, but it was some combination thereof to vote and participate in the national political system, which screened out more blacks than whites per capita. But it was just a non-racial system, and so they're not able to use that angle they take with South Africa and Rhodesia. Instead, it's this very weird situation where this country that was known for being more British than the British was destroyed by an embargo placed on it largely by America and the British, and then rebels who were aided by the Soviets and the Chinese and North Koreans. And so that presents uncomfortable questions of why were we helping the communists murder these people in a landlocked country in Africa that up until that point was mainly characterized by good race relations and growing tobacco. It doesn't fit into the nominal history of the Cold War, and there's not really a good like pro-liberal democracy angle they can take with it, because once Mandela was put in power, it turned into a disaster. So they don't like talking about that. And anyway, I think that's why it's not often brought up.
Well, I guess let's talk about a bit about the history of it. So it's I want to know, first of all, because I've heard it said before, what being more British than British means. So I'll kind of add that to this question here. But let's take a look at what the background of Rhodesia is. It's founded as a British colony, and then we have kind of this the unilateral independence, I think, and was it 63 or 65 or somewhere around that with Ian Smith. So kind of take us through what that looks like, and then also what does it mean to be more British than British?
Yeah, so that phrase is, I think, integral to Rhodesia's identity and why it became what it was. And so two like bases of historical background to keep in mind for this is, on one hand, Britain up until World War I was this world-spanning empire that was characterized not just by like trade and the Navy, but also by settlement of various places, whether it was Canada, South Africa, Rhodesia, Australia. They were pouring people into these places, and certain types of people went to different places. Paired with that is that after the 1911 Parliament Bill, the aristocracy and gentry that had traditionally been more or less in control of Britain's political destiny were under the boot of democracy in Britain, facing increasingly extortionate taxes, whether it was a 15% increment tax on land values, 90% eventually death and income taxes, huge regulations, fines, just an inability to hold on to what they had. So those are just important things to keep in mind because they come up very important for Rhodesia. So in late 1880s, early 1890s, Cecil Rhodes, who's this titan of empire, he's trying to put together this project to build the Cape to Cairo Railway, where all over Britain's imperial possessions in Africa, he wants to build this really long railway that goes up and down the continent, is like a transcontinental railroad without par.
Is that so he can get to diamonds, or what is he trying to do?
He did have these economic interests where he profited a great deal from South Africa, but it was also that he fully believed in the civilizing mission of the British Empire. And he thought that being able to tie together the colonies would improve settlement, would improve their economic value, would improve bringing people through and just showing people the colonies where they remained interested in them, and would be like a capstone project of the empire, because this was shortly after the Russians and the Americans had built their transcontinental railroads. And so it was something Britain could do on that front with modern technologies. It never quite panned out because the Congo is just horrible to get through, but they did try and came somewhat close. But so as part of that, there's this whole part of Africa north of what's now more or less modern South Africa, and then was a collection of Boer states and the Cape, which was ruled by the British, that was unsettled. There was really no one there, a few tens of thousands, maybe a little over 100,000 or more natives, but not many people for an area that's about the same landmass as Texas.
Wow.
And utterly, so just unpopulated and no civilization of note. There were a few ruins, which is where the name Zimbabwe comes from, but it was essentially just in the Stone Age. And that's what Rhodesia became, because Rhodes realized that it could be settled. And this is around the time also that they had developed the Rand mines in South Africa. So those famous mines that produce all the gold, all the diamonds, the great mineral wealth of South Africa, that was really being developed in this period. And so it was pretty easy for him to put together a company, the Rhodesia Company, that much like the Virginia Company could, on its own initiative, settle this territory. So he kind of gets the green light from the British government. They're not overly involved, nor do they stop him. And he sends north the Pioneer Column, which sets Rhodesia's identity apart from the very beginning, because it's not a collection of the rogues of empire, as you might think about, scallywags, freebooters, that sort of person.
So it's not who settled Australia.
Exactly. And it's also not really just like middle-class tenant farmers, at least in this period, of the sort that like settled Canada and turned that kind of into a grain belt. It's adventurous people who are of good moral character and are generally better educated than their peers, is who it ends up working out as being in the Pioneer Column and the early settlement groups for Rhodesia. And so they march north, they strike some deals with the chieftains, they bring along their military equipment and their agricultural equipment. And then there's a brief uprising with some of the natives in the late 1890s, and Rhodesia is tangentially involved in the Second Anglo-Boer War. But really, it's just progressing as a colony from this point forward under the protection and management of the Rhodesia Company. So not an official crown colony, it's a private colony. And what they're doing is, first they tried looking for minerals because they thought it was going to be this wealthy gold-based colony. They find some of those. It's somewhat mineral rich. But what they really found was that the soil was incredibly fertile. So they could have these huge farms because there's nothing there except for something of a labor force, but just vast, essentially unfarmed prairies, great territory. So more and more people pour in to turn it into a farming colony, and the companies start selling off land where you can do that. And so cattle, tobacco, and grain really became their big things. So the grain was more during the Bush War than in this period. And it becomes this just fabulously successful agricultural colony. And that's important because at the same time, you start getting the taxation picking up to a great degree in Britain. And all these people, landed society that has its identity rooted in the countryside, is looking around and saying, if we stay here, our family will be obliterated by taxation in the space of a couple decades. And there's not really much of a future for us here. So we're leaving, or at least we're getting a lot of our assets out of the country. And so one of the places that a lot of the more serious people in Britain start putting their landed wealth is in Rhodesia. And so that turns into these vast farms, these really successful tobacco farms. that dot Rhodesia, and whether it's peers living there, like the Duke of Montrose moved to Rhodesia, or it's private colonization efforts backed by certain powerful families in Britain, like the Duke of Westminster, the second Duke was involved with this. It's really that element is one of the key forces driving forward the settlement of Rhodesia. And then in the mid 1920s, it becomes an official crown colony, part of the Commonwealth. It's no longer ruled by the Rhodesia Company. And that state of things really lasts into the 1950s, where it's just growing in success and prosperity and population. And then after World War II, Britain decides to shed the colonies because it no longer wants to do the imperialism thing. Britain's ruled by socialists in this period. Taxation's even higher. Civilization as we know it is in all effect ended in Britain. They're confiscating everyone's assets. And so Rhodesia looks around, and first you see the Mau Maus in Kenya, where it's this horrible revolt, and the British don't really do much about it, and then give up the country and hand it over.
Was Kenya a British asset at this point too?
Yes. Sorry, I should clarify that. So,
well, no, because I apologize my ignorance of I don't know a ton about Africa, so I will definitely make sure I ask you when I don't know.
Yes. So Kenya was also part of the British Empire in this period until the 1950s, early 60s. The difference between it and Rhodesia is that while some of the more serious and better educated people settled in Rhodesia, Kenya was known as this gathering spot for the dissipated elite of Britain. So you do have some very successful farmers and family farmers, like that sort of person in Kenya. But really what it's known for is this group of drunkards and debaucherous types who hang out there after essentially been kicked out of Britain. And so it doesn't last very long. It comes to a crashing end in the 50s. Then after that, the Congo, which had been ruled by the Belgians up until 1960, is decolonized forcibly. And that is a horror show. All the worst things you can imagine happening during decolonization happen in the Congo, both in the 1961 to 62 struggle over Katanga, which the natives in Katanga decided they wanted to remain part of the Belgian state because it was so much better administered than the Congo would be on its own. But the UN and America backing the UN forcibly prevented that from happening. And then after that, you get the Simba Rebellion, which is where these drug-addicted terrorists essentially just do the worst things imaginable all through the country. It's like the Vikings are back. And the Rhodesians look at that and say, well, we're not going to participate in that course of events. We would prefer to continue having good relations with Britain, and there might be a conservative government that'll be reasonable and we can negotiate with. But if it comes to it, we're going to declare independence rather than go along with becoming the Congo or becoming Kenya. And so that's in the early 60s. And it comes to a head in 1965 when the negotiations are going nowhere. The Queen was involved in slighting Ian Smith, who becomes the prime minister because she was very much aligned with the Destroy the Empire camp. Queen Elizabeth II, I should say. And so the Rhodesians, under their new party, the Rhodesian Front, which is essentially an independence party that had pretty broad support, decides that they're going to declare independence. So the legislature votes in favor of it. The tribal chiefs, who handle most of the governance of the vast sweeping majority of Black Rhodesians, vote unanimously in favor of UDI. And on November 11th, 1965, you get the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, which is where the Rhodesians, using language from the American Declaration of Independence, decide that they're declaring their independence from Britain and leaving the British Commonwealth, excuse me. And to answer one of your side questions, the reason they're known as more British than the British was that influx of high quality people. They had a very intentional system for immigration before the Bush War started, after which they just needed more people. But before it, they were very intentional about only letting in people who would integrate well with the Rhodesian spirit and Rhodesian culture, which essentially meant an adventurous sort of landed society would probably be the best way to put it. So it has probably what was the highest IQ in the Anglosphere as a country, at least among the white settlers. And you get all the British traditions, like the country house parties, very heavy drinking, the focus on outdoors life, the landed society element. You get all that, and that's really what Rhodesia was in many respects.
So that's really interesting. And I'm curious, once they declare independence, how is that foray into independence? Because now it is a bit of a different structure. They're detached from Britain. This new government, what was the racial makeup of this government? Was it largely native? Was it largely British? What was this independence like, and how successful was it?
Yeah, so I think I should probably start with describing how their government was managed, because that
Sure.
was the crux of the fight with the British. What the British said, and what the communists supported the British in saying, and the Americans supported them in saying, was you must have one man, one vote, mass democracy. No exclusions to that are acceptable. No way around that will be acceptable to us. And the Rhodesians said, well, that's what destroyed the Congos. We're not doing that. The compromise they tried coming up with, and what became like the basis of their government, was this A roll and B roll system, where to vote in the national elections and be on the A roll, you had to have a certain amount of property or income, or a certain level of educational attainment, or some combination thereof. So it wasn't especially onerous. From what I remember, the income requirement was around like $24. It would be like $50,000 or something, or like some mix of going to college in there. So it was something like that, where it really just screened out the bottom, or the people who weren't cutting it as responsible citizens. A lot of whites didn't qualify, most blacks didn't qualify, but it wasn't a racialist system. It was just like across the board, you have to meet these qualifications. As part of that, there was also the B-roll system, which had much lesser requirements and was meant to get more people involved, but that was primarily local elections. And then the tribal trust area, which was about half the country, was set aside for Africans or Black Rhodesians who wanted to keep living in the tribal mode of life. And they were largely managed by the tribal chiefs. And those chiefs then had seats in the national legislature. So instead of doing voting, they just did it through the chiefs, which the vast majority of the Rhodesian blacks found perfectly acceptable, and that was fine. It was a small group of about 300,000 blacks who primarily lived in the cities and worked in urban occupations, who became the nucleus of the communist movement and were hostile to that system because they weren't represented by any tribal chiefs and largely didn't meet the A-roll requirements. So that's where that came from. But the government was primarily like white farmers, and then tribal chiefs would be the best like way to think about who's running it, along with some urban bent on the white side.
And I think that's an important distinction, because I want people to understand that, though it's not equal between black and white, it's also not exclusionary. And so I think it is important to point that out.
Right. And that ties into their larger mindset regarding the like black-white split, and why they were known for having really quite good on the whole relations between the groups. It was like the civilizing mission that Rhodes had represented was still part of what they were up to. So they're trying to get people to pull themselves up and be part of the system by saying that they could be part of it. And that worked on the whole. Independence at first, they ran into a couple problems and a couple benefits. One good thing for them was that because relations were so good between black and white, there wasn't really much of an internal communist subversion threat. The main threat they faced was terrorists who were based in Zambia, which had originally been known as Northern Rhodesia. And then when it received independence from Britain under a one-man, one-vote system, it became ruled by a communist dictator and called itself Zambia. And that dictator gave a base to the communist terrorists. And so the main...
So it's substantially larger than Zimbabwe as it looks on the map in terms of... And it's, I guess, to the northwest is what we're looking at?
It's northwest. And so its main resource was a copper belt. It's especially rich in copper ore, but it never really had many white settlers, only about 3,000 or 5,000. So it was a somewhat different animal. They were just in a federation together along with Nyasaland. So the rebels are trying to infiltrate into Rhodesia from Zambia for the first like 10-ish years of the war, which limits the war somewhat and gives the Rhodesians more time to prepare, which is very good. Similarly, their two main allies in the war. Israel became an ally later on, but for most of the war, their two main allies are South Africa, which they had mixed relations with over their history, but for the first part of the war, it was a pretty good ally. And their closest ally was the Portuguese, who were ruled by Salazar up until 1974. And Salazar received glowing comments about himself from Ian Smith, who thought he was the perfect gentleman and a very good leader. And he was fighting to hold on to Portugal's remaining colonies, namely Angola and Mozambique. And Mozambique borders Rhodesia to its east and northeast. And it's a very long border. So that was a mission critical objective for them, was keeping Portugal in Mozambique and fighting the communist terrorists who were trying to secede from Portugal, because Rhodesia's main outlet to the sea was the port of Beira, which is in very south of Mozambique, and Rhodesia is landlocked. So the only way it could import oil, or export its crops, really, or at least economically, was through that port. And so that was the first 10 years of the war, was them trying to stop the infiltration from Zambia and trying to prop up the Portuguese in Mozambique. The problem for them was that because the West was so hostile to their, I'll just call it property voting because that's the easiest way to describe it. Because the West was so hostile to that system, because it wasn't egalitarian mass democracy, and because the communists were going to support the communist rebels no matter what, it really faced the hostility of like all of the world other than Portugal and South Africa, which wasn't great because its main economy was exporting tobacco, exporting some minerals, and exporting some beef. So it really struggled to maintain itself economically for a bit, and there was a worry that the sanctions regime placed on it in 1968 was a mandatory sanctions regime from the UN, which is very atypical. Normally, UN sanctions are like voluntary participation, but these were mandatory. And the British sent their navy to blockade Beira, so the Rhodesians would legally import oil, but the navy at that point was so decayed that the blockade didn't really work, which is, sad days for Britain, about track with what it was up to at the time. But so that's how the early war went. Was the Rhodesians, the fighting wasn't that severe. It was really that they had to get their economy and their society like on its feet and holding together, which they had largely managed to do by the early 1970s.
Well, I guess let's talk a little bit about the war. I guess what is the cause of it? Who are the combatants? You mentioned Israel, South Africa, and other allies, but I guess what does that kind of lineup look like? And then as well, going through your research, there was also a reference to the CIA in some way knowing what was actually happening, and I guess in a lot of ways, not really doing anything about it. So I'd like to kind of get into what that looks like around the Bush War.
Yeah, so you're told when you're learning about the Cold War and the CIA that it was like this collection of the coolest guys ever who fought communists in every little spot. Maybe that was true under Eisenhower.
Well, Hollywood would like you to think so.
Yeah, exactly. But in 1970, what the CIA was up to was helping the communists take over Rhodesia, in which is insane. And so that really fit into the matter of framing, where Rhodesia's argument, and this was always its argument, was we're a successful country. We don't oppress the blacks. They generally like the Rhodesian Front government, which you say is a racist government. But why destroy us on behalf of communism when we could be a bulwark against communism in a critical area of the world? Because you need our resources, you need the food we can export, and you certainly need the resources in South Africa because it's so rich in these minerals. The West, perhaps some conservatives were willing to listen to that argument, but largely the counter argument was you're racist, and so we also don't think you're fighting communists, so we're not going to help you. But the CIA issued this report on, and they said, well, Rhodesia is well governed and it is prosperous and it is fighting the communists, but we think it's racist, so we need to help the communists instead of helping the Rhodesians. And that was like the advice provided by the CIA, is what that report essentially says. Of course, that's paraphrasing, but that's like the message of the report, which is shocking. You wouldn't expect that, but that's what the CIA was up to. What that fits into with the war is the West, up until like 1980, never had a military presence in Rhodesia. What it did have was the ability to enforce that embargo, where the Rhodesians couldn't buy weapons abroad, except from South Africa, an ally. They couldn't really ship their cash crops abroad. They couldn't import like medicines or oil from abroad unless they could run the blockade. So they were under siege for all 15 years of the Bush War. And that was the West's role in the war, was enforcing that state of things and then providing the moral cover to the communists by saying Rhodesia is a racist state. It's racist to support it. You have to go along with backing Mugabe and Nkomo, who we're going to present as these like cheery grandfather type fellows, even though they're just bloodthirsty communists, which is insane, but that's what was going on. The other side is that the communists were directly involved in backing the rebels. Nkomo was a Ndebele, which is one of the tribes in the country, and he was backed by the Soviets, and he was largely based out of Zambia, from what I remember. Then once Mozambique fell to the communists in 1974, the front opened up tremendously because that's such a bigger border than Zambia is. And that's largely where Mugabe was based out of, though that wasn't exclusive and both sides were involved in both places. But Mugabe was a Shona, which is the other main black tribe in Rhodesia, and he was backed by the communist Chinese and by the North Koreans. And so from 1975 on, Rhodesia is in pretty dire straits because not only is it continuing to face hostility from the West and from the communist bloc, but the rebels have such a bigger border to work with, and it can't import the weapons it would need to fight that effectively. It can't import aircraft. It can't really import helicopters, though it does manage to sneak a few in from Israel. It just, its war effort was significantly constrained by the embargo. So that's a struggle for it. And the war becomes this mix of it trying to strike the communist base camps in primarily Mozambique, but also occasionally Zambia. And those are where the big operations you see on Twitter, like Operation Elend, where like 4 Rhodesians are wounded and 2,000 communists are killed, come from, were those strikes in enemy territory. And at the same time, its second tier units were used to try and shield the farmers from guerrilla attacks, because the main communist strategy was weakening the Rhodesian state and economy by sneaking into the country and then attacking white-owned farms to try and kill the families, destroy the crops, place landmines in the roads that would blow up civilian vehicles, because they understood that in doing that, they would destroy the economic basis of the country and force so many whites to flee that the country would have a hard time continuing with the war effort after that point. And so those are the two conflicting strategies. The Rhodesians trying to hold out and wait for a sane conservative government in the West to give them a lifeline, and the communists are trying to weaken them before that can happen. And that's why the tactics developed as they did.
So is it something that starts as like guerrilla tactics and the Rhodesian government starts sending in military forces, or what are they actually fighting about?
Yeah, so it starts, and the Rhodesians try treating it as like a police action. So you have these crazy stories of like police officers in their dress blues tromping through the bush, trying to find guerrillas who had attacked Rhodesian farms because they wanted to treat it as a police matter rather than a military one. That largely has to wake up to reality by the mid 60s, or like 67 or so. And for those first like 10ish years, it's pretty small, like just light infantry on light infantry, guerrilla and counter guerrilla war. From 1975 to 1979 or 80, it's a much bigger conflict, but also much more the same. So at the farmer level, the war was largely the same as it had been in 1965, just with far more attacks and with far more territory encompassed by that, because the rebels could infiltrate from so many more places. And there was never, like, other than very occasionally in Mozambique, which had some tanks, there was never like mechanized combat. Artillery didn't play a huge role. The Rhodesians had some armed helicopters and some bombers that played something of a role, but really it remained light infantry on light infantry warfare. The main air power play was that the Rhodesians had these fire force missions for which they're famous, where they would try and locate the terrorists, and then paratroopers would jump out of the planes at like treetop level and jump right onto the terrorists and try and fight them. And
Wow.
often having to do so like 6 times a day because the military was so overburdened. But they were fighting about the revolution, where the communists were trying to inflict enough of a military like attrition defeat on the Rhodesians that the Rhodesians would give in and hand off power to whoever the leader of the rebel coalition was at that time. And the Rhodesians were just trying to stop that from happening and keep things as they had been in 1965.
So basically, they're trying to make Rhodesia unlivable for the current government, so people just basically give up the nation to them.
Right, because that also played into the population dynamics in Rhodesia, because the rebels have two things going for them. One is that because the country is so big relative to the size of particularly the white population and the military that could be recruited, it was hard for the Rhodesians to do anything more than respond to attacks. So where the rebels were able to sneak into the tribal trust lands, which again was about half the country, and that's where the blacks lived in these like tribal type settlements just as they wanted to. The terrorists were able to like torture them into supporting them. And while the black population started the war on the side of the Rhodesians, that support weakened as they were just terrorized into supporting the terrorists. And so that was one weakness for the Rhodesian state, was that there was a ticking clock on how long it would be before like a lot of the country was in either outside its control or in a state of semi-open revolt. The other problem was that the like mid 1950s group of Rhodesian colonists were a pretty committed and homogenous group. They had to get through that pretty tough like screening criteria for the immigration system. They generally came with somewhat more capital. They had large farms in the country that they were trying to hold on to. And many of them, because they had come so early and had been there for multiple generations, saw it as something of like a family project, much as, you know, if you have a family farm in America or Britain, you'd see it as a family project. We really want to hold on to it. That wasn't as much the case with the second batch of immigrants who were really there for economic opportunity because Britain was such a hellhole with the rationing and socialist rule after World War II. So like starting in, you know, it really was around the mid 50s that this became the problem. So that second group, which was a lot of people, was much more willing to just leave. And as conditions got worse. So after the white population reached its apogee around 1975, and then starting in 76, it's just falling tremendously each year, which starves the Rhodesians of that economic power those people might have kept with them, and really vitally of recruits that were desperately needed by the army. And so the terrorists do whatever they can to accelerate that, which is probably the worst atrocities of the war were when two civilian aircraft were shot down by surface-to-air missiles by Nkomo's men.
Gosh.
And yeah, so the airplanes were shot down, and then the survivors, because there are many survivors, were not helped and instead raped and bayoneted by Nkomo's terrorists. And Nkomo admitted to it. And after he admitted to it, Jimmy Carter, our president, and Andy Young, who was a civil rights leader, who was one of Carter's friends, continued praising Nkomo and calling him a man of peace and saying it didn't matter. Even after he had admitted to this horrible, two times they had done this, and twice he admitted to it. And Carter and Young said it didn't matter. They didn't care. So that was, in those attacks, they were just terrorism meant to terrorize the white population into leaving, was that rebel strategy playing out.
Oh my gosh, that's terrifying. And I don't know what else to say about it. That's just, how could a human come to that level to do that to another human? It's just shocking to me.
Yeah, it's awful.
So I guess when we look at, you know, towards the end of this conflict, it goes on for a good 15-ish years. We have the Lancaster Agreement that happens in 1979, and then we also have Robert Mugabe is elected in 1980. What changed in the country after that point, and how did they basically dismantle what was Rhodesia?
Yeah, so in 78 and 79, that's when the population crisis becomes critical. Also during that time, the terrorists managed to blow up a large portion of Rhodesia's oil reserves, which, because it couldn't really import oil, were crucial to its war effort and economy. And so when those are blown up, though they can kind of import more oil from South Africa, it's a huge problem. And the Rhodesians start negotiating to try and bring about an end to the war in more earnestness. The first thing they come up with is they try and end the propertied voting system and replace it with a moderate, like white and black government led by a black Rhodesian named Bishop Abel Merzera. I can never pronounce his name, but he was something of a moderate. He was willing to work with the legacy Rhodesian government and state, and they were going to call the country Rhodesia Zimbabwe, or Zimbabwe Rhodesia. And they hoped that like moderate agreement would prove acceptable to Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and then through her America, and would give them a way to end the war without just handing power over to the communist terrorists with whom they'd been fighting for about 15 years. Thatcher, and this was really the reason that Smith saw it as such a betrayal and why the Rhodesians just gave up. So Thatcher was this conservative who was supposedly a tough fighter against communism, and she just refuses to go along with that negotiated peace, that negotiated end of the war, and says, no, you have to give off power to either Nkomo or Mugabe. We need, you need to go along with what we're telling you. We're not going to let you negotiate your way out of this. And so the Rhodesians, who had been hoping for a Western leader like Thatcher to take power so they could find this negotiated end, realized that ideological constraints make that probably impossible, and they're going to just need to end it, which is why they are willing to just give up in 1979 instead of fight to the bitter end because they didn't really see where that would lead to be positive. That then leads where the Merzawa, however you say his name, government is in charge for about a year until 1980 when Lord Christopher Soames, during a ceasefire, comes in and says he's going to manage the election and it's going to be a fair election and we'll see who wins it. Mugabe just has his terrorist army torture and murder the country into voting for him, which is very obvious. Soames and the others.
Sounds like late Roman Republic elections. They would have guys lining the bridges on the way to the ballot boxes and say, "I hope you're voting for my guy, or you're not going to be walking away."
Yeah, it was essentially that. That's a good way of putting it. And so Mugabe, of course, wins because he's the only one doing that. And he wins the election. He's in power. He at that point, the British just wanted the situation to be over. So they said, all right, Mugabe won fair and square. We're leaving. He's in charge. And he becomes a dictator at that point. And then I guess we can get into the decline however you want from there.
Well, I guess let's talk about that decline. Like, what does that look like? How does Rhodesia change? How does this affect the population living there? What does that decline look like?
Yeah, so there are a couple different stages to it. The first is that, as I mentioned earlier, Mugabe was a Shona and Nkomo was a Ndebele. And the two tribes had always hated each other, even before British rule, but during that it became somewhat intense. And so Mugabe's first thing is he genocides the Ndebele. He doesn't kill all of them, but he kills like 50,000 of them, and it's enough to cement the Shona's rule as...
So he's basically killing other Black African tribes at this point?
Yes.
Wow.
Because of like tribal conflicts and wanting to be in power. This is another thing where, much like the election, the Western onlookers see it, report it, and the government say, we don't care. He's in charge and we've achieved democracy. So the fact that this dictator is murdering 50,000 of his own people doesn't bother us in the slightest. And so that was called the Gukundi. It ends after a couple years. The North Korean unit was brought in to achieve much of it. But other than that, the country didn't go as badly as people expected at first. And not that the Gurukundi isn't a tragedy, but people were expecting just a Congo type Ragnarok, which didn't occur yet. Because Mugabe, for one, he liked luxuries from Britain, like his Savile Row suits, his Rolls Royces, all that stuff. So he was wanting to maintain relations with them, which is just as trite as it sounds. And then the other thing was that the British, as part of the end of the war, had said to Mugabe, and this is paraphrasing, but we know you want to take white land. We don't want you to just expropriate it. So what we're going to do is we're going to financially backstop this, at least for a period, where if you take people to court and get a ruling against them, then you can buy their farm and we'll help foot the bill for that. And so that happens for the first decade and a half. Is Zimbabwe isn't great. Mugabe is a dictator. He's imprisoning the opposition. A few people are murdered. A number of atrocities are inflicted against whites and blacks. But it was a relatively functional country throughout most of the 80s, essentially. Things come to a head in the 90s because, on one hand, Mugabe's veterans had been promised farmland if they helped him win the war. They had helped him win the war, and they hadn't gotten their farmlands because he's largely just left that in the hands of the whites and slowly been buying some of it with the help of the British. So they say, we won our bonus. You promised us land. You need to give it to us. He tries buying them off at first. He essentially loots the treasury of everything it has and just gives them a one-time payment and says, here's your $50,000 or whatever it was. Let's call it good. The soldiers spend all the money immediately. They don't call it good. And then so right after that, they're like, okay, that was fun, but we want our farms now. So at this point, Zimbabwe, and this is in the late 90s, Zimbabwe is out of money because he looted the treasury. It's increasingly looking like there's going to be expropriation. The soldiers or former terrorists are in an increasingly violent mood. There's been a lot of white flight from the country because who would want to live in this situation? And so the economy is already on a weak footing. And most crucially, the British are just tired of this. They've been spending hundreds of millions of pounds on dealing with this former colony that's ruled by this madman. And so they say, we're done funding this. It's over. You shouldn't expropriate stuff, but we're not going to backstop you anymore. So then in the 2000s, this is the end stage. And this is probably what people know about Zimbabwe. Mugabe, after a Zimbabwean Supreme Court ruling to give it cover of law, essentially just allows his veterans to squat on white farmland and take it, sometimes killing the owners, and says the state's going to expropriate the white farms and not pay anyone. So we're just going to take it through that process as well. That occurs over about a little over half a decade. That's like in the mid 2000s until by 2013, there's not a single white-owned farm left in the country. It'd all been expropriated. Wow. One fortunate thing was that because relations between the white and black Rhodesians and then Zimbabweans had been relatively good at like the local level between either farmers and their workers or farmers and villagers, of course not in the government, but at the local level, there wasn't like a Congo-style genocide. There wasn't really a Simba rebellion where just like everyone was murdered. There were murders and a number of people did die and there were atrocities that occurred, but largely they managed to stay away from that, and it was just their property taken and they left, which was bad, but it could have been worse. And so as Mugabe takes everything and his cronies take everything, was of course how it went, where some of the terrorists got small farms that they immediately ran into the ground, and a lot of the farms just went to various political allies of Mugabe's. The country fell off a cliff economically. Its main thing had been being the breadbasket of Africa. It grew enough grain, really starting in the Bush War and then continuing thereafter to feed the whole southern part of Africa. Its tobacco was famous, and it exported a great deal of tobacco, particularly after the sanctions were over. It had these hugely successful cattle farms. Those were over. And so the country just falls off a cliff because it can't export any of that anymore. Farming production, mineral production, industrial production all declined by like, I want to say over 2/3. It was between a half and 75%, depending on what industry. And because so much of the population was dependent upon being farm laborers for work, about 80% of the country ends up out of work while all this is happening. And so that's a disaster. And then because Zimbabwe has these large debts, but isn't earning any foreign exchange anymore, it can't pay its debts. So it starts printing money. And that's how you get the like 16 quadrillion percent inflation and all that. The $100 trillion Zimbabwean note, if you've seen those, like that's where this comes out of. And so that's just the like utter collapse of the country over that period. Mugabe then dies, I want to say 2017. His
2019 is what I can see here.
Okay. And then he was also overthrown by the military in this period. So like 2017 to 19, the Mugabes are done away with and the military takes over. And then it realizes that this whole thing has been a catastrophe and starts trying to bring white former farmers back into the country again. And it's had limited success in doing that.
That's wild, because it's like you basically, I guess the thing to look at, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, because obviously I don't have your level of knowledge on it, and I'm just kind of, my brain's just running on what you're telling me here, but it sounds like they really just swapped one regime for another, and lives didn't really improve, and a lot of people suffered even more with a harsher government.
Yeah, the Rhodesian government, the constant critique of it, and this is something that William F. Buckley promulgated and the leftists and the media promulgated and the U.S. government promulgated, is that because it was not egalitarian mass democracy as we were after the Civil Rights Act, it was an illegitimate state for that reason and had to be done away with, whatever the consequences in prosperity or bloodshed or any other metric. That didn't really matter. It was just that it was unacceptable. But then Mugabe took over, and of course he's not a democracy enjoyer. He took over the country as a dictator and killed his political enemies. But because it didn't have the veneer of being a racial system, because it was rooted just in like communism rather than in natural hierarchy, the West went along with it and said it was fine and didn't really want to touch the issue and open up that box of worms.
So you've described in your article on South Africa just followed Rhodesia's path to ruin. You warn that South Africa's recent land expropriation laws could follow similar economic collapse and violence. So I guess when we look at that, what could South Africa learn from, I guess, what happened in Rhodesia? And I guess looking at this as well, I think we could see, not to the scale, but we could see parts of this kind of globally happening as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, South Africa is much like Rhodesia in terms of farming, and that there are half of Rhodesian land was set aside for the tribal areas where they could practice what amounted to Stone Age agriculture. And it's very unproductive. It destroys the soil. It's a mess, but it's how they like living. And so Rhodesia let it happen. And most of the country's farming production then comes from a very small number of white-owned, heavily capitalized commercial farms. So like modern fertilizers, modern industrial agriculture machinery, pesticides, all that stuff, which, we can, there's the regenerative agriculture debate, which is, don't need to get into that here. But, say you're trying to feed a continent, you have to do some of these things. The Rhodesian, it's a small number of farms that do it. And so it's like a little bit of the white population supporting the country by providing the food. That was kind of the case in Rhodesia, though there were more farms. Now in South Africa, because the apartheid government ended in the 90s and then Mandela took over, and really South Africa has gotten worse and worse and worse since then. A lot of farmers have left, and at this point I think it's under like 100,000 South Africans run the farms that feed the country. It's not really like that many farms left. Many of them are big, and they're run like a grain farm in the American prairie where you use all the machinery. It's heavily capitalized. It's very productive and efficient, but there's not that many of them. And the reason I go to that detail and why that matters is the South African government has declared, under changes to the law made the end of 2024 and beginning of 2025, that under the South African Constitution, expropriation of private property is allowed if for reasons of economic equity, amongst other reasons. But the economic equity one is the big one, because they then changed the law to recognizing that portion of the Constitution. They would no longer have to provide compensation in cases where land is taken for reasons of economic equity. And the obvious target, based on the propaganda of the current South African regime and what it has said about the matter and what it looks like it's already starting to do with this change in the law, that means seizing those few white-owned farms that are left, which is a problem because they not only feed South Africa, but feed like a lot of Africa at this point, because Zimbabwe has been knocked out, Zambia was knocked out, the rest of the continent, other than kind of Kenya, were never really that agriculturally efficient. So now it's down to South Africa. It's down to somewhere around 100,000 farmers in South Africa, and their farms are their farms are what the South African government plans on taking. It's what's being targeted, the economic equity legislation. And so if that happens, and if you look at the relative drop in agricultural production in Rhodesia, and then equalizing the statistics in terms of relative productivity of white-owned farms versus black-owned farms on the same type of farmland, what that probably means is that South African agricultural production, if this law is carried out to the maximum, will decline by about 3/4, which essentially means that famine is coming because there will be no one left on the continent, the southern part of the continent, producing enough food to feed it. So maybe they'll be able to bring in food aid, but then again, maybe not, because they won't be able to buy any. So they'll be relying on our generosity. And Trump has shown that he's skeptical at best of the ANC regime. So they are staring their own destruction in the face because they're going to try doing what Mugabe did, which is take all the white-owned farms. And in their case, it'll be even more disaster because there's nowhere left to flee to and no one left to feed them. And they've shown that when they do this, food production craters tremendously.
It sounds like something out of Atlas Shrugged. Like you kind of you push all the people out that know how to create all the things you need. Mm-hmm. Other people try to run those things that just might not know how to run them, and all of a sudden things start breaking, and then there's no food and no industry. It's we've been warned about things like this for years, and I don't think it has anything to do with race relations. I think it's more about what a communistic type system does to people, right? It's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it not being a racial thing is one of the reasons I like talking about Rhodesia, is because it never had an apartheid system. It didn't do these things, and it was just the like envy and spite and desire for mass egalitarianism that wiped the country out. And so you have a famine, you have all these people dying, and it's a catastrophe. And it could have been prevented by just remaining sane, but they refused to do that. So,
What would you say is the lesson that we should learn modernly from observing and understanding what happened in Rhodesia?
yeah, the first thing is that there is no escape. I think a common flaw in American political thinking on the right is, well, if I just move to Wyoming or broadly the woods, then all will be well. Those floods of savage urbanites aren't gonna, toss me into the cannibals pot if I live like on a mountain in Tennessee, and so that'll be great, and I'll be able to just wait it out. No, maybe you can if you hide in a cave or whatever and wait for the flood tide of race communism to pass you on by. But much more likely, and what we saw in Rhodesia is that for one, you will succeed in whatever your ventures are. And this is something we're seeing in red states. They're doing quite well right now. But that will be unacceptable to the powers that be. And particularly if it's rooted in any sort of natural hierarchy, natural distinction, non-egalitarian practices, procedures, theories, that's unacceptable and it will be crushed. And no matter where you are, no matter how you try to hide, it will come for you. So what that means, that necessitates fighting in the political arena and trying to push back against it and doing so before it comes to that, because you're not just going to be able to hide and wait it out. That doesn't work. Rhodesia was a small landlocked country of a few million people, only 250,000 of whom were white, in the middle of Africa at a time when America was collapsing because of like economic crises and crime and losing a war in Vietnam. And still we took the time to go destroy it. So that's important to keep in mind, and I think is a big lesson. The other thing is like the success and prosperity that can come from recognizing nature and reality. The Rhodesian state was never cruel. It didn't do these things that you see in like the Jim Crow South or apartheid South African government, where it's like petty indignities and stuff like that. It just recognized reality and that some people are going to be better stewards than others, whether of their own lives or of the country's future. And so it tried to empower them by screening the incompetent out of the governmental process. And until that was destroyed by the entire world, that worked really well. It was prosperous. It was the breadbasket of Africa. It built civilization out of nothing in under a century. It was really an impressive country and achieved a great deal and was a reflection of this aristocratic, exceptional mindset and ethos that was, I think, really something different and exciting. It was much like Virginia in its early days, or Britain back before it was kind of wrecked by ridiculous legislation. So anyway, I think Rhodesia stands as a test case, both of the fact that they will come for you, and that if you give yourself, through political change or whatever, the freedom to flourish, there's a great deal that can be accomplished just by recognizing nature and building a society around that.
I think that's really important to understand. And I think when you look at it as well, you even look at how our government is going and changing today. We have a society that favors people like Lindsey Graham, so it's
Exactly.
we're still not doing so great, and that doesn't really have a whole lot to do with race.
Yeah, when you have Lindsey Graham and Jerry Nadler in control, that's just going to be, by its very nature, a different sort of.
What do you call Jerry Nadler's body shape? Like, what is that?
It's like the penguin from Batman.
Well, Will, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I do really encourage people to go read your work, as you've written a lot about it. It's very well thought out. It's very thoughtful. So for people that want to follow you or check out your writing, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I primarily post all my stuff on Twitter. I'm just at Will_Tanner_1 on there, and post a lot. My more serious and thoughtful work is on Substack at theamericantribune.news, where I write about this stuff and then other lenses like Britain or America. But Rhodesia and South Africa have been some of my big focuses in the past. And I do a podcast called The Old World, where I have discussions about things like this with other people I find interesting. So you can check me at it any of those places.
Very cool. And guys, thank you for checking out this episode. I know this was a little different, but it is a really important topic for us to check out, and kind of the the broader arch of Western culture. We have another book interview coming up a couple weeks after this one. We're interviewing Memory Medieval about jousting in the dueling in the medieval era, which I'm very excited to dive into, as I'm very interested in it. But reminder, if you're brand new to this channel or brand new to this show, if you're on the podcast, make sure you subscribe to us wherever you're listening. If you're watching the video, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. And reminder, you can sign up for the book club over at atheniumbooks.com. Thanks for hanging out with us today, everybody.